Why did Matthew write his gospel? I think the way to understand Matthew is to understand he's writing to Jewish Christians. The earliest church fathers indicated that's why Matthew wrote his gospel. And he's trying to answer a Jewish question. To the Jews, the king and the kingdom came together kind of like horse and carriage. That's what the Hebrew scriptures teach. And yet these Jews had believed that Jesus is their Messiah, and yet the kingdom, as it's described in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, hadn't materialized yet. So they were starting to wonder, if Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, then where is the kingdom? And so Matthew basically wrote a gospel trying to explain to him that yes, Jesus is the Jewish king, but the long-awaited kingdom, the reason it didn't come the way the Old Testament said it would is because Israel rejected Christ as the king. Now this remnant has received him as the king, but the nation as a whole had rejected him as the king. And so Matthew is writing to explain to them that yes, Jesus is the king, but the long-awaited kingdom is in a state of not cancellation, but postponement. And everything that Matthew records in his gospel relates to that subject. What are the major parts of the Gospel of Matthew? Well, chapters 1 and 2 is what I would call the pedigree of the king. It's explaining who Jesus is, starting with his genealogy, linking him back to Abraham and David. And then you get into chapters 3 and 4, and you have the preparation of the king and how he was prepared for his ministry, how John the Baptist came pointing the way to Jesus. And then you have chapters 5 through 7, which would be the pedagogy of the king. That would be the teaching of the king, and that's the Sermon on the Mount. And that basically explains that the kingdom that Jesus was offering was political, to be sure, but it was also ethical and moral in tone. And that ethical part of it is why the Pharisees turned it down. Then you have chapters 8 through 10, where you have the power of the king, and there you see a bunch of miracles of Christ demonstrating exactly who he is. Then you have chapters 11 and 12, the progressive rejection of the king, and that's essentially where the kingdom offer was extended to Israel and rejected, and that section culminates in the Pharisees attributing Christ's miracles to the devil. And then you have chapters 13 through 20, which is basically the program of the king. What is the program of the king while the kingdom is absent? And that's where you have the revelation of the church. Matthew 16, verse 18, Jesus discloses there that I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And that's where he outlines the course of this present age through about 8 parables in chapter 13. And it's also where he prepares the disciples for their ministry in this new age of the church that's coming. Then you have chapters 21 through 23, which is the presentation of the king, and it's describing how Israel's decision to reject Christ was formally ratified, how Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday and exactly on time, prophetically, and proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, yet Israel, through a bunch of sham trials where they ignored their own rules of evidence, turned Christ down. And then you have chapters 24 through 25, which are the prophecies of the king, and that's basically about how the kingdom offer will one day be extended to Israel in the tribulation period after the church has been removed, and how this long-awaited kingdom will finally come once the nation responds correctly to the king and his offer of the kingdom. And that'll be for a distant generation of Israel. And then you have chapters 26 through 27, which is the passion of the king, and that's basically all of the events surrounding his crucifixion. And then finally you have chapter 28, which is the power of the king, which is his bodily resurrection from the dead, and the gospel sort of ends with his charge to the church while the kingdom is not here to go and preach the gospel to all creatures and to make disciples of all nations.